Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Pamela Eastfeld, la présidente de La PAS, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our PAFSO breakfast with Neil Cochrane. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am hosting this meeting from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future guardians and caretakers of these lands. And I know that people are joining from different places, so I encourage you as part of this to think about the traditional peoples of the lands that you're on, and what all of that means for us and for the lives that we are all very privileged to lead today. I'm just going to read quickly from the book overview from Neil's book, Beyond Numbers, and ask and then I will turn over the floor. Neil, I understand, is going to speak mostly in English, but is happy to answer questions in dans l'autre langue officielle si vous voudriez. Vous pouvez poser des questions en français aussi. So in 1982, Neil Cochrane had a young family and needed steady work. The federal government was an attractive employer in his hometown of Ottawa, but memories of a tedious summer pushing paper at the Department of Justice left him fretting that the price for a secure public service job could be a life of drudgery. When he landed a frontline immigration officer position, he needn't have worried about the doldrums. In Canada and at diplomatic missions in India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines, he bore witness to the determined struggles of people hoping for a new life in a new land. Ultimately, he was invited to join the team rewriting Canada's immigration laws in the offices of the same Department of Justice where he once toiled as a summer student. Then, after nearly a quarter century as a director in the department's admissibility branch, he walked away from his career with Canada Immigration. In Beyond Numbers, he takes us on an insider tour of Canada's immigration service, and a very interesting one as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Neil, and let him talk to you. I'm going to turn off my camera so you don't see my weird little face interfering. We're going to go to the next slide, which shows the book. And I will keep an eye on the Q&A box and the chat, just and just in case there's any sort of hot pursuit questions, but otherwise Neil will take questions at the end. And I will also type this in the chat. We're going to do a giveaway of a copy of Neil's book. So while I'll put the information in the chat, but if you're interested in winning a copy, I'm going to ask you to send me an email, and then tomorrow we will draw the names and get you a book. So Neil, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to PAFSO members about my memoir. Before I go into the book, though, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. As mentioned, I'm born and raised here in Ottawa, where I still live today in retirement. I'm a graduate of the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. I spent nearly 25 years in the immigration service. I was a frontline officer at the local office here in Ottawa, dealing with the public, and we also had responsibility for the airport. I moved to headquarters for a couple of years before our posting overseas, which took my family to New Delhi. Then I was back in Ottawa, where, except for some short TD, I spent the rest of my career with immigration. I served as director in the enforcement branch, and later as a director of policy and legislation in what was then called the admissibility branch. And as mentioned by Pam, then I made the surprising decision to leave the department in 2005. So I've been happily retired for 10 whole years now. I can't believe it's been 10 years. I've been keeping busy with family and friends. I learned to play the guitar, which is very exciting because I'd never played any music before. I've been able to travel to some interesting places when there was no pandemic. And I'm currently volunteering a couple of days a week in a long-term care home, which I'm enjoying immensely. And I highly recommend to anyone who's looking to fill some time, and especially in your retirement years, and you might be just looking for a little bit more purpose in your life. And of course, what brings me here today is I've also, when inspired, I've been doing some writing, which brings me to the book. So after I retired, I enrolled in a number of creative writing workshops. at Carleton University and with other organizations here in Ottawa. And I started out by writing bite-sized pieces of fiction, short stories mainly. But as I worked on those stories, I found my thoughts being drifting back to anecdotes from my years with Canada immigration. Those stories just had such rich material. I had great difficulty resisting going back and rewriting them, and revisiting them, and writing them into to some form of a book or collection of nonfiction stories. But I really didn't want to go back in time. I knew that would be probably an emotional experience and there would be challenges because it was from so long ago. But I essentially felt those stories kind of just hijacked my agenda, and I just could not resist the pressure internally to write about them. So at first, I crafted about 7 or 8 stories back in 2017, and the focus was on my encounters with members of the public in the immigration context. And then I set those stories aside to concentrate on other things. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had more stories. And as I was writing those first stories, other ideas, other memories were triggered. And I realized I could write quite a few stories about my time at immigration. And then during the pandemic, like a lot of people did, I found myself with the momentum, certainly the time and energy. And I completed my first manuscript in the spring of 2020. And that first manuscript was 50,000 words. But I realized I had an interesting package. And then over the next few years, after many rounds of revision, I self published the book in January of this year. So, what's the book about? Well, there was the very first review to appear on the Amazon website described it as a career well lived. I thought that was a very apt description. In fact, I wish I'd thought of it myself. So the main focus is a collection of stories involving my encounters with immigration clients and hearing their stories, bearing witness to their struggles, their hopes, and their dreams, and sharing how all this affected me. So here are some examples of the stories that I share. Soon after joining the department, I was assigned to go to the University of Ottawa campus to interview international students. Back then, we provided on-site services to renew their student permits. And I remember one woman, I think it was my first day there, who was visibly intimidated by my position of authority. And this was something I had not experienced before. And I described how I tried to navigate that whole awkward scenario and the surprising result that it led to. Later, as a director or a coordinator of the Foreign Domestic Movement program in Ottawa, I found myself interviewing nannies and other domestic workers all day long for almost a year. And I recount hearing with frustration from domestic workers who shared stories of the mistreatment that they suffered at the hands of their employers, but at the same time, they were unwilling to make a formal complaint for fear of losing their job. I talk about when I was assigned to carry out a couple of deportations, and I found myself in the lounge at the Ottawa airport with a woman I was deporting after escorting her from the jail out on Innes Road. And this was a time before cell phones, so we had nothing to keep ourselves occupied, and we sat in silence, and her flight was delayed repeatedly. And I described my bungled efforts to initiate some sort of conversation with her and to hear more about her story. And there again, the surprising outcome as we bonded as parents of young children just before she had to catch her flight. And so in those awkward moments where you're the immigration authority, you know, we're still very much humans, and there was a lot of human connection. In other stories, I recall sitting across from inmates in federal prisons while I was arguing before the tribunal for their deportation. And I also talk about interviewing couples to determine if their marriage was genuine or whether it was a marriage of convenience, and comparing that to sort of feelings at times like a bit of a game show host. Also, in the early years, in one of my chapters, I recount having been one of the first volunteers to ever present what was called cross-cultural awareness training at the time, and what that was like with a sometimes recalcitrant audience of immigration officers across Ontario. Now, in terms of my time overseas, I have a chapter where I talk about the inexact science of visitor visa decisions, the challenges of assessing a refugee family's prospects for successful establishment in Canada while using an interpreter, and the heartbreak I experienced when a request to go to Canada for critical medical care went off the rails. On a more positive note, I bring readers into the interview with a family who dreamt to go to Canada and didn't quite meet our requirements, but I was able to approve their application using the discretionary authority that we had in certain situations. In another story, I recount a very exciting first trip to Dhaka for an itinerant service trip. At the time, they had no visa office presence in Bangladesh, so we served them out of New Delhi. And that very first morning that I was driven to the airport or to the High Commission turned out to be quite a harrowing experience as there was a national strike. In that section of the book where I'm recounting my time in New Delhi, I also benefited greatly from letters I had sent home to my parents. In my first letter to my parents, I opened the letter by asking them to retain those letters. I said, this will serve as our journal while we're overseas. But when I returned to Canada, I never asked for those letters. I had forgotten I'd made that request. And it was just in the last couple of years before she passed away, one day my mother presented me with this large brown envelope and said, here, you asked me to hold on to these for you. So I took the letters, I set them aside, but I was never in the right frame of mind to go down that memory lane. But this memoir project served as a wonderful impetus for me to do that during the pandemic. And so I read through them, and it was amazing. It helped bolster my memories of events back then. And in fact, I decided in the end that I would just take some excerpts from those letters and sprinkle them throughout that part of the book where we're living in New Delhi. So I write about our experiences in New Delhi. I talk about the challenges at work and some of the major events that were going on in the society in India at the time. So while I started off wanting to write about my frontline experiences, which I thought were really compelling stories, as I was finishing up those stories, it became apparent to me that the story just didn't feel complete. As one of my friends who was serving as an informal writing coach at the time said, and then what happened, which is something all writers want to hear. But that led me to, okay, now I have to write about the rest of the story, which is some of the internal goings on and some of the difficult times in the 1990s, especially. So I write about the National Public Service strike in September of 1991. I share my very personal experience during the program review exercise where there were significant budget cuts and I received a layoff notice and had to compete if I wanted to stay employed at the time. And the book continues throughout. I talk about soon after I got home from India, I was investigated by the Canadian Human Rights Commission because of a complaint that had been received from someone that I dealt with while I was in South Asia. And then I go on to talk about my role as a director in the development of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And finally, to the surprise of many, I write about my decision to actually look for a new opportunity, which surprised many because many people knew how dedicated I was and how devoted I was to the immigration program and how much I enjoyed my work. So this last part, though, was probably one of the more challenging aspects of the whole project for me personally. Maybe it's inevitable, but I found myself just sort of spilling my thoughts, trying to understand my decision, which I don't come to a firm conclusion about. But I have to say, it was quite cathartic, and it was unexpectedly a bit of a juicy rant, which maybe is not totally unexpected when you've worked somewhere for 25 years. There were many changes happening. We were pivoting away from the personal service that had really been the mainstay of the delivery of the program for many years, and I lamented what was being lost. Now, the tone, however, of this last part of the book really wasn't the tone that I wanted to strike for the reader. I was facing the dilemma. I want my writing to be honest, but I also want this to be a pleasant experience for the reader. So I struggled mightily. In the end, I found a compromise that I could live with, cutting back some of the vitriol, perhaps I would say. And fortunately, though, I was able to conclude the book with what I think is a very positive and uplifting epilogue of a story that occurred almost a year after I left the immigration department in the streets of Ottawa one morning when I was on my way to my new job. Also, in the memoir, what you'll find are some flashbacks here and there that I think are relevant to the story. For a memoir to be truly engaging, it's necessary to let the reader in, let them know a little bit who you are, where you come from, what are your motivations, what are the experiences that shaped you at a young age. And there's one story in particular that I find very poignant, and it was a story of tragedy. And it was a tragedy in our neighborhood, and quite conveniently for this project, it involved my earliest recollection of an encounter with an immigrant family. Ottawa wasn't a very diverse community back when I was growing up in the 60s. So they were kind of an outlier, and certainly that story of tragedy was an outlier. And as I revisited it and I wrote about it, I realized just how much it affected me. But in the process of telling that story, I'm also able to share with the reader quite a lot about my parents and how they responded to the situation. So it was just they say show, don't tell. It was a wonderful opportunity for me as a writer to say, and this is how my parents operated, and this was their view of the world. Um, there are times in the book where I include references to my family, especially while we were in India, because obviously that was an adventure for all of us. I'm happy to say my wife, Barb, and our three children each made thoughtful contributions to my manuscript, and they've been very supportive of this project. Now, what's important about this book? Well, I wanted to satisfy a long-standing desire to write interesting and entertaining stories. One of my beta readers before I went to publication, she gave me some feedback, and one of the things she wrote was, "You must have carried these stories close to your heart." Again, I wish I'd thought of that myself, because it was very apropos and it was bang on. These stories, I carried them close to my heart, and revisiting them really stirred up a lot of emotions that I guess it's typical when writing a memoir and revisiting an earlier period of your life. There are many things that at the time you really don't have time to process if you're in the peak of your life with family and career. So it's a difficult experience on the one hand, but I felt a strong sense of pride as well, pride in what we accomplished, but also proud to say I had such an interesting career and such meaningful work. And I found myself at one point in the book when I'm writing about having received my layoff notice and thinking about, well, what am I going to do if my career in the public service catches a bullet? And I thought, well, I could become an immigration consultant. The changes that were happening in the program were certainly creating an environment for a blooming ecosystem of consultants and lawyers as people turned to them when they couldn't experience the same sort of personal, helpful service that was available previously. So I said, and I wrote, I could always charge people a lot of money to help them navigate the immigration system, but I didn't want to do that. I was a public servant. Scratch that. I was a proud public servant. And as I wrapped up the project and made the decision to put this out in the world, I'm hearing in the media, especially post pandemic or during the pandemic, an increasingly negative narrative about public servants. And I feel strongly that they're not being that the narrative isn't fair and isn't balanced. And anything I can do to put out stories that will counter this narrative, I feel compelled to do. And I think there should be more public servants telling their stories, celebrating their stories, Even though mine is from long ago and it's probably viewed as a bit of a history lesson, I think the lesson still remains true today. So, a big realization for me that really surprised me is that even though I left the immigration program in 2005 and I worked another 10 years, another 10 interesting years, um, it's not an exaggeration to say I simply left my heart in Canada's immigration program. And writing about it brought a sense of closure that I never realized was missing until now. Just before I wrap up, I want to end with a couple of readings from the book that I've selected from my time working overseas. The first is recalling the first refugee family from Afghanistan that I interviewed a couple of months after I arrived in New Delhi. The first refugee family I met included a couple, their three children, and the man's mother. They wore faded clothes and were dusty from the journey into the city. Their faces told a story of hardship. The interview took longer than scheduled. I had experience with interpreters in Canada, but here, simple questions to confirm names and ages seemed to launch the recitation of a novella before a two-word answer in English came my way. While I sat patiently waiting for replies to my questions, I noticed the family configuration mirrored my own: girl, boy, girl, although they were a little older. How hot were the flames under this father to make a better life for his family? Obviously, it was like nothing I'd ever know. Through the language and cultural barrier, I hadn't been able to form a strong opinion about their future prospects, but I had to wrap things up. Maybe, I thought, I just needed more experience, but I would find that most of these interviews were similarly frustrating. As I delivered my decision, I stood and moved to the doorway of my office to see them out. This was the first of a full slate of interviews that day, and I had already fallen behind. I was eager to get on to the next appointment. I told them everything was in order as long as they passed the medical exams and a background check. They would be going to Canada. I opened the door and waited as the interpreter informed them of my decision. When he finished, the grandmother dropped to her knees, grabbed my feet firmly, and kissed the tops of my shoes. I was unable to move as she softly spoke words I couldn't understand. I looked to the interpreter. She is saying, "Thank you, thank you. My grandchildren will have a future." My feet were in the vice grip of the weathered hands of a caring grandmother. Her family tried to pull her up, but she resisted, continued to clasp my feet tightly, and began to cry. After they left, the interpreter took a deep breath and released it slowly, in apparent exasperation. He explained that officers don't tell refugees the results of the interview to avoid these kinds of scenes. They were informed of the decision by letter, which they usually receive after 3 or 4 weeks. I thought it was sad that we made them wait longer for the news they so desperately wanted to hear, simply to avoid emotional outbursts. But having experienced it once, I could understand. So I'm sure you can see how that experience would stay with me. The second reading I want to share is from one of the excerpts I wrote to my parents, and it really outlines just how hard we worked um, in the immigration program, and certainly during our itinerant service trips, they were always grueling, but they were exciting. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sitting in the airplane at the airport in Bombay, waiting to take off for Delhi. This is the end of my last trip to Bombay, and although I've worked as hard as I've ever worked, it was quite enjoyable. We work 10-hour days with just 10 minutes for lunch all week. This is the busiest time of year in our business. We issued over 1,100 visas to visit Canada in what was by far an all-time record for a one-week trip. Some days I interviewed as many as 300 people, and that was written in May of 1991. So with that, I'll pass the floor back to you, Pam. I just want to reiterate how pleased I am to have had this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing some questions.
Thanks, Neil. That's so interesting, and thank you. We really appreciate that you were willing to come and talk to us about this. It happens that Neil and I have a mutual friend who also volunteers at the Pearly at the same place, and she mentioned to me, "Hey, do you know this guy who just wrote a book about the immigration service?" And I said, "Well, I've seen the book, and I've been meaning to try to reach out to see if he would be willing to do a PAFSO breakfast." So she was able to put us in touch, and it was another one of those small world moments. Because I knew that this was going to be really of interest to our members and to the Foreign Service community. So, I think there is a dearth of information about, what the day-to-day work is like and what the life is like for Foreign Service officers, and others working in different, different aspects of these files. So it's great that you're willing to add your personal experience, with the benefit of analysis and maybe a little bit of hindsight, I guess, in
Mm,
some of the things. But I just want to encourage our participants. I mean, there's only a few of you, so if you want to talk, you can put up your hand, and I will make you a panelist if you like, and so that you could talk to Neil more directly. But there is also the Q&A box and the chat in that where you could type in a question. But while we wait for them to think about their questions, I'm wondering, I mean, I am also an aspiring writer myself. And I'm just
mm.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about your path to publication. I mean, did you have to go to your former employer and ask for any kind of permission or vet your material, or was there anything like that that happened, or did you pretty much have free reign? And what was the response of the of your former colleagues when, I presume you talked to some people when you were writing and told them what you were doing. I mean, how was it received? Did was everyone open, or were there any concerns or anything like that?
Well, thanks for the question. That's very interesting. I didn't seek any kind of permission. While writing, of course, there are certain guardrails you have to respect. Some of them are legal. Of course, there are privacy considerations, and so I don't disclose the identity of any of our clients. That's all anonymous, and even coworkers. I changed the names of pretty much everyone, um, with a couple of exceptions. One, because the book kind of oddly and unexpectedly became a tribute to one of my former bosses, who was just this uh, no, outrageously unconventional character. But the parts of our interactions that I recount are more in the context of what I would refer to as our friendship than his professional capacity, even though it often took place at work. Then there are executives whose it's a matter of public record that they were in that position. And I think in the end, I only used one of them. But I'm pretty confident that he would be just fine with that in any event. So there are also some, I guess, national security issues, but we're talking 25 years ago. And also, there are some stories I wouldn't write about, just to be cautious. There are also some stories that I think people may have found interesting, but I didn't feel it was my story to tell. It would have been really someone else's story. They were at the heart of the story, and it's if they want that pain to be shared, it's for them to share. So you have a number of considerations as you're going through your storytelling and what to leave in and what to leave out. In terms of yeah, one of the wonderful benefits of this whole exercise for me is, as I was writing, I reached out to a few former colleagues, some I hadn't been in touch with in quite a while. One of them, who I didn't really know at all for years, but I knew Mike Malloy had written a book about the Indo-Chinese refugee movement in the 1970s, which is titled "Running on Empty." And I had read his book, and I know he's very involved with the Canadian Immigration Historical Society. So I reached out to them and said, "Look, I have this manuscript, and could somebody maybe take a look? I don't know if there's any way we can collaborate." But Mike actually was very generous with his time and very encouraging. And last week at the gala event, I turned around and I came face to face with Mike. Hadn't seen him in about 30 years or more. There's all these reconnections that are happening with people I hadn't talked to, and writing about them made me realize just how much I miss them. I've been contacted by foreign service officers who just read my book and saw my email in the book and sent me a lovely response saying that how much it resonated with their own experiences, the sentiments and the stories. And so that's been really quite moving to hear from so many people, foreign service officers and immigration people, and even one of the immigration program managers overseas today, who I never met, sent me a really nice message.
Well, that's great. So that makes a great segue to the first of our two questions that we have here. So Megan, hi Megan. Megan is also on our PAFSO XCOM and an immigration officer currently on post in Ankara with previous posts in Bogota and TDs in Islamabad, Uganda, etc. And she's saying she's so glad that you have managed to get these stories down on to share, and this is really valuable for people in the field. So she's asking, in this rapidly evolving world, what advice do you have for immigration officers who are currently out there?
Mm,
Just, the easy questions, right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the world is evolving very rapidly. I, um, I think uh, I think it would be in the realm of human connection. I know it's a challenge in our technological world and the way applications are processed. But as you're performing your duties, I think it's to recognize that, whether it's behind an application, um, that these are people with dreams and hopes, and I think that the importance of the decisions being made in the immigration context can't be overstated. So, I suspect that the vast majority of people working in the field already recognize that. But I think it's harder to maintain that when you don't have the face to face contact that was constant back in the day. So, that would be my plea. And to also use I guess, rely on your creativity wherever you can, because there are many challenges that, the policies and guidelines won't cover off every situation, and to have, to know at the end, to be able to finish your day knowing, okay, so today I applied fairness, I was conscientious, and I was within the bounds of my duties. I did the best I could for people and for Canada.
Yeah. I'm just going to abuse the position of the chair and add a follow on for myself before we get to Megan's next question. But I'm just wondering, what about like do you did you run across issues or moments where, I mean, how did you feel about the cultural awareness aspect of what immigration officers do? I mean, this is coming to mind for me because my first long posting was in Nairobi. And I
Mm,
had, to be honest, very limited exposure to, certainly to Kenya, but like to Africa in general, East Africa. And I remember that for the first few months that I was there, there was an expression when I was meeting with, people, especially people from particular, ethnic groups, particularly men. They would talk to me, especially young men, and they had an expression on their face to me that I read as hostility and contempt, frankly.
mm, mm,
And then a few months later, and I used to really sort of get my back up. I had to kind of, always be aware and, not react to that. And then a few months later, we were hiring for a position in one of the sections, and I was asked to be part of the hiring team. And we did an interview and with this young guy, and he had that expression on his face. And I
mm,
was just, glowering, thinking like, wow, this is really bad, if you're acting like this, when you're trying to get
mm,
hired by us. And then my LES colleague said, I said, "Whoa, what did you think of that interview?" And she said, "Oh, I felt so sorry for that young man. He was so frightened.
mm,
Was so frightened during the
mm.
interview, and it was so clear, and I was like, wait a minute, that's like, you read that expression as fear? And she said, oh yeah, and I mean, it made sense because often when I was interacting with people, we were in a position of power, frankly, over them, and certainly we were in this interview, and it was like this giant light bulb moment that I went then back over, all of these other interactions that
Mm,
I had and realized, yeah, people were scared when they were talking to me.
mhm,
And I had been reading it as, they were as hostility. And I mean, I hope I didn't do anything bad during that period, but for me it was definitely a big moment where I realized, okay, I have to educate myself about these things. And I'm just
mhm.
wondering if that kind of thing was something that you dealt with, and if you have advice for anybody and what they should how they should navigate those things.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I spent about 6 months back in the '80s as one of the very first people. They adopted a peer training model, and so we developed with the help of some academics. I think it was a 3-day workshop, and so we delved into some examples. Some of the examples were, well, I guess, today we would not view that as that. That would be something people would understand as we've gained more understanding over time as we become a more diverse society. So I think, in your story, what's really important is you asked one of your LES. And so if there's one thing to remember is, first of all, have that awareness that maybe I'm misinterpreting things. Always ask yourself that question and then remain curious, because it's not possible to understand every little nuance of all cultures and all their behaviors. And if you try to, you'll drive yourself crazy. But it just, with that attitude of maybe I'm misinterpreting and maybe I should ask somebody. I think that would be the bottom line.
Yeah, maintaining that curiosity, yeah, I mean, I'm glad I did, and I'm glad
Hmm.
that I didn't just kind of assume that I was right, assume that my emotional reaction to their emotional reaction was the right one. I mean, but it taught me very early on, taught me a good lesson there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Megan, so we have another question. They said, we're also in a climate where immigration is hyper political. See the current situation in LA, which was triggered by immigration
Hmm.
crackdowns. How
Hmm.
do we advocate for Canada to remain a leader in this space, respecting our international commitments while maintaining the support of Canadian citizens? Another easy question.
Yeah. Thanks for that easy question. Yeah, it's such a challenge, and particularly, you know, I, I don't have an easy answer. What I will comment is that for someone like me who worked in the program where, we tried to balance all these competing interests, trying to ensure that we were doing right by the people coming to Canada so they would have either the skills to successfully establish themselves or the supports in place, and witnessing what's happened more recently, where we seem to have really sort of, well, muddied the waters in terms of whether you're coming to remain temporarily or permanently, and also allowing people to come mainly as students, or who will rely on working here, who don't have the means to support themselves before they get here, and all this stuff, um, without coordinating with the municipalities and the provinces to ensure the services that we could reasonably foresee would be needed were in place. And it's so unfortunate, and it's actually, to me, it's a little heartbreaking to read that last week the government announced, of all things, and for people who worked in the immigration program when I was there, to think the government is going to ban asylum claims if someone's been in Canada for a year. Like, this is such a major turnaround in our asylum policy, but it's kind of, we brought it on ourselves, and I think it's very sad. I think it's very sad, and I don't have a good answer to the question, because we've kind of, I think we've put ourselves in a very difficult position to respond and maintain some of the values that I think were at the core of our immigration program for a lot of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad because I think that, there were people who were trying to sound the alarm for a while, saying, listen, we're not joined up enough. We're not able to actually take care of people when they're here and offer you know, the services and the things that people need to really make a go of things.
Mm,
when they get
Yeah.
here. And I think that, there was an inclination maybe to dismiss some of that as, you're hostile to immigration in general, you're
Mm.
hostile to asylum seekers. And that's pretty unfair, right? That comes back to bite us in ways
Mhm.
that we don't that now, now sadly it's people in need who are paying the price in
Yeah.
many ways. But I mean, I personally am kind of hoping that, this more what's the word I'm looking for? Like this sort of like a little bit more hard-headed willingness to look at things and really say, okay, what do we actually need? And
Mm.
what is in Canada's interest? And I hope we're taking an enlightened interest,
Mhm.
perspective, but to look and say, okay, what do we really need to do here? And how do we actually do it? And can we do it? I'm hoping that over, that might result in things being in things being improved for everyone. But I can't help but feel like it's going to be a painful process getting there.
Absolutely.
I mean, I remember, even back before I went on my last posting, when I went to Warsaw in 2012. I remember talking even to colleagues, who were in the international education space, and they were sounding the alarm saying, we're worried about, some of the schools that are bringing people in, some of the, the supports that they were concerned were not there, in terms of housing or, in terms
Mhm.
of people coming and, paying a lot of money for things that were not really going to get them a proper degree and, all these kinds of things. And they had a very hard time getting heard,
Yes.
and
I
then
think
it's
there was, I'm sorry, Pam. I think there was a misplaced confidence that, our government is managing the immigration program. They give us the numbers every year. It doesn't sound like a dramatic increase, and you have confidence that the government is planning, correct? But then we had the emergence of what I refer to as shadow immigration, which are, they don't count as permanent residents, but we're now bringing in large numbers of people on the understanding that they can apply to remain. And yet, we didn't really accommodate those in the equation, I don't think. So, those sort of shadow immigration streams um, were seen as well. We expect if they're bringing these people to Canada, it must be that there's a plan, and we understand the risks, and we're managing the risks. And you're right. The people who early on tried to raise alarms were dismissed for the reasons you've outlined. And I think there was a turning point when the premier of Quebec started to um, vocalize the struggles they were experiencing in Quebec, especially with the people coming across at Roxham Road. And then more stories started to emerge of like foreign students using food banks, and food bank managers were speaking out to raise the alarms. And I think that's when people realized, okay, these are, you know, especially a food bank manager, these are people who are committed to serving the community, and they're having a problem and they're raising the alarm. So it
Mhm.
had to get to that point.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I know the situation in Ottawa. I used to volunteer at a food bank, these monthly dinner things, and I started to notice that, yeah, a lot of foreign students showing up, you
Mm,
know? And I mean, at first it was kind of like, well, okay, all students are short of money and, this is for everyone and so on. And then we started to notice that it wasn't just people kind of coming, with the impression of, hey, I don't want to eat at home, and I know I can go to this place and have a nice dinner.
mm,
And more people who were very clearly like would not have been eating that day if they didn't come to the
mm,
dinner in the church basement. It was, and yeah, I feel like there was a kind of a backlash at first of people kind of being like, well, what are you saying? Are you being racist that you're saying that people shouldn't come? And it's
mm,
like, no, no, that's not what we're saying. But we're saying there's a new pattern emerging here, and
mm.
it's a disturbing one. Um, yeah, yeah,
As a former policy manager from back in the day, it's really puzzling to me how we would have let this happen on such a wide scale.
it's
And
this is
to admit foreign students who clearly didn't have the means of supporting themselves, didn't have accommodation arranged before their arrival. It's puzzling.
It really to me is kind of a breakdown in, what the military calls like joined up thinking, joined up planning, you know?
Mm,
The British
exactly.
military loves that, are we joined up? And I mean, not everybody who seeks to be joined up can achieve it, or even if it's what they're trying to do. But I really do like I look at some of, not just in the immigration space, but in a number of other spaces, and I think it seems like there was kind of a breakdown in the pipeline of information flowing and being reacted to at different levels. I mean, I know it's really complex, right? When you're looking at
Hmm.
immigration to Canada, you have to involve municipal governments, you have to involve like the
Hmm.
service, the NGO sectors, the charity, quote unquote sectors, all these things, municipal, provincial, federal, across the country. It's not easy, but I I feel
Hmm.
I yeah, I feel like something broke down there, and hopefully now, I mean it's sad to say, but it's sad that it had to get to a crisis, but maybe now that it is, it will get fixed and we can start, doing right by the people who need that to happen.
Hmm.
Wait. We're down to a couple participants, and I offered both of them to be promoted to panelists. I don't know if they want to accept that or no. Um, but I give them the chance. They can pop up and say hi if they want to. In some cases, it's early morning or late at night, and people may not be ready for prime time, might not want to do that. But I wanted to offer the chance. And Neil, is there any last words you would like to say before we're getting close to 10 o'clock? So I was thinking if we're ready to wrap up, we can say goodbye. You can say your last words. I can then
Sure.
say goodbye, and I can stop the recording and give a chance for folks to chat. Oh,
Uh,
before we
mhm.
finish, I just wanted to remind everyone, you included, that PAFSO is sponsoring this free screening of A Shining Light, a
Mm,
Vietnamese Canadian Legacy, which is an immigration related movie. It's a documentary film about an extraordinary mother-daughter story spanning an escape from war-torn Vietnam, birth on a sinking ship, a heroic rescue at sea, and a path to a new life in Canada. So there are immigration officers involved in this story, and we
mhm.
are hosting this free showing at the Bytown on Thursday, June 19th at 7 p.m. So if you go to the website to my latest message, you can sign up at the Eventbrite link. It's free, but they're asking everybody just to register to get your tickets. So I just want to get my plug in there before we finish. And now over to you for your last words. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Sure. I just want to say that the people working in our immigration program continue to have my admiration, and I can only hope that you enjoy your careers and you have exciting, interesting opportunities similar to what I've recounted in my memoir. And you have my support.
Thanks, Neil. I think people really appreciate that. One of our parties just said they have to jump off and they say thank you. And so I have stopped, paused the recording. Um, but yes, thank you so much. This is great. And I mean, I know that you were in touch with Lillian about doing an excerpt, having an
Mhm.
excerpt from the book in Bout de Papier.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we made you aware of our upcoming Dip Notes book.
Mm,
Um, we're doing a book for our 60th anniversary of formation as a professional association. And
sure.
so what we've decided to do is have we're putting together a book called Dip Notes. And the idea is to answer that question that so many of us have and that we get all the time, which is, what can I read that would give me a sense of, what life as a Foreign Service officer is all about? Because really there's nothing. I mean, when I started back in the last century, I don't like to say how long ago anymore these days, but I was looking in my hometown, looking for something about written by a human about the life there, and all I could find was Charles Ritchie's diaries, which were, they were interesting and fun to read, but not so relevant, in the late 90s to mid 90s to what things were going on. So we're taking some of our best articles from Bout de Papier and organizing things by decades and according to different themes, and then we're
Mm,
doing essays in the middle, in between them.
mm,
Into sort of into the gaps, or asking people maybe to look back on their article that they wrote 20 years ago or whatever, and we're going to put that all together. We're self-publishing. It's going to be like we'll have hard copies, kind of coffee table size books with the photos that were in the Boo articles and so on, and then we're going to do an ebook, and we're basically going to make the ebook pretty much free. The coffee table book will have a few copies to give away, but we're probably going to charge people the cost of printing.
hmm.
So that would be a bit more, but that way people want to give their parents something when their parents are saying, "What is it you do?"
Yeah,
We'll have something to hand over, and I think it'll be a good project.
yeah, it will. That sounds very exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I just want to have I'm gonna, try to get my name on there with my other two colleagues who are working on there as like editor so that I can say, "Hey, I have something published."
Wonderful.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think it'll be fun. So, any comments or questions or anything anybody wants to say, now that we're not recording before Neil goes? Neil, any off the record things? What I wanted to say was about the whole immigration thing is I blame what happened to the civil service, especially the senior civil service under Harper. I'm sorry. I think they intimidated people so much. They just got surrounded by, so many like
Hmm,
yes people who were scared to say anything, scared, and and then people promoted up the other people, people who made them comfortable. There were people
hmm,
who were put in positions who were not. And I mean, I'm not singling out anybody in particular at immigration or GAC when I say this, but just across the board, I feel like there were a lot of people who were promoted for the wrong reasons
hmm,
and were not confident about their subject matter knowledge and so on, and so didn't want to be surrounded by other people who might challenge them,
hmm.
wanted similar people around them. And, we're now seeing that.
Yeah, I don't have any insights, but I guess I'm just very disappointed that I like to think that behind closed doors, there were some fierce debates and discussions where people spoke truth to power and didn't just try to gloss things over. Although I kind of questions that some of the things I've heard coming from senior officials. I remember seeing an official from IRCC uh, before the Parliamentary Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, citing numbers from about 15 years ago before we introduced the Safe Third Country Agreement, and using those as a crutch to sort of dismiss the soaring numbers that we were seeing entering Canada and saying, well, they're tracking with historical numbers. And I thought, yes, but we don't have a tool like the Safe Third Country Agreement that we can now implement to deal with the situation. What can we do? I just thought it was a very sort of a sanguine, hands off. I thought, and now that may not have been representative because you're speaking before a committee and parliamentarians and for the public. But
Yeah.
I would hope that behind the scenes they were saying, look, we've really got to make some difficult decisions because here's the outcome that we're going to be facing, and then you're going to have what many people are characterizing as an increasing anti-immigrant sentiment. I don't believe it's anti-immigrant. I think it's just an opposition to mismanagement of the immigration program and letting things get to the point where they're harmful to Canadian communities and to the people who are desperate to come here as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that yeah, I think it's important. I think, for people who have a bit of knowledge on this to say, what you're saying, like, listen, opposition to mismanagement and concern about the well-being of, the people who are here already
Mm,
is it like that's not anti-immigration. that should not be conflated.
Hmm.
I don't
Yeah,
think it's fair,
yeah.
you know? And I think that what it does is it makes people think that they can't speak up and like and it makes people angry. And then if they're angry and they feel like they're not being heard, well, then you do get
Hmm.
deterioration sometimes in people's attitudes, right? And yeah, I think we
Yeah,
could listen better. Well, and not just listen better, but also
yeah.
act.
We have a big. We're facing a big challenge, and hopefully we're up to the task.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so too. I think we are. I mean, the military has a great expression, Christitude. And I don't want to sound like that Pollyanna person saying, "Oh, there's a silver lining in everything."
Yeah, yeah.
Honestly, I mean, there are things we should have been facing a long time ago that now we have to face.
Hmm.
And I hope that, we come out better for really, really facing them. I mean, we
Yeah.
may come out with like some limitations that we don't like, but
Hmm.
hopefully we'll come out with something that we can, you know, we may not be able to do everything we like, but what
Hmm.
we do, we will like what we do and we will be able to do it properly,
Hmm. Sure.
and I think I'm hoping that that's what happens. And we, PAFSO, we're going to do our best to, be in there with our opinions, and events like what you're doing, discussions like this are helpful to all of that.
Hmm.
Discuss.
Good.
Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Well, Pam, I really appreciate the opportunity. I always love to talk about my book but I tell my family I have a chance to talk about my book and say to someone else, please go.
This is great. Well, and I will, when the recording is done, I'll send you the link so that you can listen or watch or whatever and make sure you're okay with it. And then we'll post it on our YouTube, and then I'll send you the link to the YouTube posting. I mean, like I say, we don't index them like so that,
Hmm.
random people will not find them on the web usually, but we're happy if it's shared around, and
Yeah,
you can certainly share with your family and friends and all of
that's
that.
good. That sounds great. So you'll let me know who I'm sending a book to sometime in the next couple of days.
Yeah, if that's okay. I was thinking, I mean, yeah, I'll maybe give it a day or two after we post,
Hmm.
just because there might be some people who watch the video who say, "Oh,
Oh
I
yeah,
like the book too," if
yeah,
that's okay. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. That would
Yeah.
be great. Yeah. So
Okay.
thanks again.
Thank you.
I'll let you get on with your day.
I will do that, you too. And
Okay.
yes, thanks very much. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.